Live from Washington, this is BBC News. President Trump signs his flagship tax and spending bill into law during a 4th of July celebration at the White House. Flash floods in Texas kill 13 people. At least 20 children staying at a summer camp are still unaccounted for. Local officials say a massive search is now underway.
Do some serious praying this afternoon, on your knees kind of praying, that we find these young girls and that they're only unaccounted for because they're somewhere that we don't know yet.
Hamas says it's handed mediators a positive response to a U.S. brokered ceasefire proposal. Hello, I'm Carl Nassman. Welcome to the program. Right here in Washington, President Donald Trump has now signed that massive Republican-led tax and spending bill into law. It's the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill. It funds trillions of dollars in tax breaks, particularly for businesses and individual top earners. It boosts funding for border security and deportations, and also gives the Pentagon money to create a missile defense shield. Those were all, of course, big priorities for the president. Before signing the legislation, Mr. Trump gave a wide-ranging speech lasting more than 20 minutes at an event coinciding with July 4th, America's Independence Day.
So many different groups of people are being taken care of, the military and civilians of all types, jobs of all types. We're adding things like the biggest tax cut in the history of our country, child tax credits. So many things are being added that we wouldn't even have time to discuss them.
Our senior reporter, Bernd Busman, has the latest from the White House.
There's a celebratory mood at the White House just after President Trump signed his One Big Beautiful Bill into law just behind me. In brief remarks given on the White House lawn, President Trump made it clear that he sees this as the fulfillment of everything he promised his supporters during the 2024 electoral campaign. From no taxes on tips and no estate taxes to benefits for farmers and a strong military, additional resources for border and immigration enforcement, President Trump really does see this bill as the signature part of his domestic policy, which has made everything he promised come to fruition in the White House's view. Now, of course, he also had to thank Republican lawmakers who helped push this through over the opposition of some moderate Republicans from New York, for example, and the Freedom Caucus. But ultimately, he got this over the line, which he sees as a very significant domestic victory. But the event wasn't just about domestic policy. He also spoke about a strong military and the strike on Iran, and over the White House, 2 B-2 bombers, the type which participated in the strike on Iran, flew over. So for him, it's a bit of a double celebration. He sees this both as a celebration of his domestic win, which is what he sees the bill as, and the strike on Iran, which is perhaps the most high-profile moment of his foreign policy so far. Now, of course, this does nothing to assuage the concerns of Democrats and some Republicans who are still opposed to aspects of the bill, cuts to food assistance and Medicaid, for example, that they fear could harm their constituents and potentially have an impact in the upcoming 2026 midterms. But for the White House and for President Trump, they clearly see this as perhaps the biggest moment of the administration so far. And in the weeks and months ahead, we'll be hearing them make the case to ordinary Americans that they see this as something that could benefit the economy and ultimately Americans across the country.
Hamas says it submitted a positive response to a U.S. brokered Gaza ceasefire proposal. The group added in a statement that it was, quote, seriously ready to enter immediately into a round of negotiations. It's not yet confirmed if it will accept the proposals. The prospects of fresh talks about a ceasefire in Gaza come before a visit by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to Washington, where he will meet President Trump on Monday. Our correspondent Auni Wells sent us this update from Jerusalem.
So Hamas has said in a statement that it has responded positively to this ceasefire proposal in the response that it has submitted to mediators. But this doesn't mean that Hamas is necessarily going to accept this ceasefire proposal. In fact, a Palestinian official close to talks has told the BBC that there are 3 changes that Hamas has requested specifically. Firstly, they want an end to the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, that controversial controversial US and Israeli-backed aid distributor in Gaza. This organization has been mired in controversy since it started operating in Gaza in late May, not least because of the near-daily reports of Palestinians being shot at by IDF soldiers, for example, while trying to seek aid at some of their distribution centers. This is something which the Israeli military has denied is deliberate. Hamas has said, as part of its demands, that it would like instead all aid to be distributed by the UN or other international relief agencies. Now, it has also said that it wants the Israeli military to return to its positions in Gaza before the last ceasefire essentially collapsed in March. So they would like a sort of withdrawal of the Israeli troops to those positions before March in Gaza. Now, finally, as well, Hamas has said that it wants a guarantee from the US that hostilities will not continue if a permanent agreement isn't reached at the end of this ceasefire. So essentially, this is a message from Hamas to the US, to President Donald Trump, that it wants a guarantee that this war will end. If it gets that guarantee, then it seems to be suggesting that this ceasefire proposal is something that it could accept. Now, this has been really the main sticking point throughout negotiations, because Hamas has repeatedly said that it would like a commitment to the war ending as part of any ceasefire deal. That is something which Israel has previously rejected. So it's not necessarily clearer, especially in the absence of an Israeli response, whether we are yet closer to a ceasefire agreement between the two sides.
Well, Gaza's Hamas-run health ministry has said that 138 people were killed in the latest 24-hour reporting period. A BBC investigation has confirmed that at least 26 civilians were killed on Monday when an Israeli airstrike hit a popular beachfront cafe in Gaza City. Among the dead, students, artists, a female boxer, and a teenage girl who'd come to study using the cafe's internet. Israel says that it was targeting a Hamas operative, one of whom was reportedly inside, but many of the victims were celebrating birthdays or sipping tea. Survivors of that strike called it a massacre. You can read a lot more of the BBC investigation on our website. That's bbc.com/news. I've been speaking about that incident with Michael Link. He's a former special rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories from 2016 to 2022. What does international law say about these kinds of incidents where there might be strikes targeting the enemy, but then there are several civilians killed at the same time?
One of the key cornerstones of international humanitarian law, which governs the laws of war and occupation, is proportionality. That, in fact, it's legal for a attacking army to focus on killing or taking out a target, and with the possible consequences of having civilians killed nearby, but the killing of civilians has to be proportionate to the value of the target. I doubt if I would ever come across an international humanitarian lawyer who would say that the killing of one mid-level Hamas militant in that cafe was worth the lives of 15 or 25 or 40 civilians who appear to have been killed by that airstrike with respect to this. So this would be deemed to be, if that is indeed the evidence, probably to be a war crime, which would be added to the long toll of crimes that have been counted by the International Criminal Court's investigations and by groups like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch with respect to how Israel has conducted itself during the 21 months of this military campaign.
I also want to ask you about what we're seeing taking place when it comes to aid access in the territory. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, backed by Israel and the U.S., is really mostly taking control of the distribution of aid right now. A former security contractor told the BBC this week that he witnessed colleagues firing on Palestinians who didn't pose a threat. If there were some sort of investigation into the GHF, what do you think it might find?
Well, I suspect it might find if the figures reported by the United Nations that there have been in the range of 600 plus Palestinian civilians killed over the last 5 weeks, while either at the aid sites themselves or on their way to the aid sites, killed by either these U.S. military contractors or by the IDF. Those as well would deem to be war crimes, and they may even be a component of an investigation into whether or not genocide is being committed in Gaza. Keep in mind that that the United Nations itself has said that this is the operations of this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is weaponizing food and promoting starvation, all of which are forbidden by international humanitarian law. I mean, the key points to keep in mind is that when the UN was bringing in humanitarian aid, particularly in the period after the first ceasefire at the end of January to the beginning of March of 2025, they were distributing food to about 400 food depots. In fact, the food was being brought to where the people were. We have 4 food depots that are being run by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, 3 in the south of Gaza and 1 in the middle of Gaza, none in the north of Gaza. And that's contrary to the way in which international humanitarian organizations would wind up operating, that you don't force the people, particularly people who went through 11 weeks of an absolute cutoff of all humanitarian aid, who are probably in a weakened condition, who are starving or suffering the effects of a famine, to walk 5, 10, or 15 kilometers to try to get food. And there's less food available for all the people than there are people showing up to try to getting it.
While I have you here, and only about a minute left, but I do want to ask you about events taking place in the West Bank. There's been an uptick in settler violence, some villages there set on fire. Does it seem to you like potentially, just given everything that's happening in Gaza, the world has taken its eye off of events in the West Bank?
Yes, it has. I don't see reporting or any in-depth reporting in most news locations that I'm looking at from the global north. Keep in mind this: we have 35,000 Palestinians who've been displaced by the Israeli army over the last 3 months from 3 major refugee camps in the north of Gaza with no place to go, and their homes are currently being destroyed by the IDF. We have in 2023 a record number of settler attacks on Palestinians. That was exceeded by an even greater number in 2024. And if the first 5 months of 2025 continue at the same pace, 2025 will be a record number of attacks by Israeli settlers on Palestinians, causing either death, injury, or property damage. This is with the consent of the Israeli army.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky says that he had a very important conversation with President Trump in which they agreed to work towards increasing Ukraine's protection from aerial attack. It's the first time they've spoken since Washington announced earlier this week that it was halting some weapons deliveries. That's reported to affect systems like the Patriot air defense batteries. Overnight, Russia carried out its biggest bombardment of Ukraine of the war. Hundreds of Russian drones and missiles struck the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. You see some of the explosions there. 1 person was killed and at least 26 others were injured. Let's speak live now to Charles Kupchan. He's a professor at Georgetown and a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Always great to have you on the BBC. We heard there that phone call between the 2 presidents, Trump and Zelensky. Apparently, Mr. Trump now saying that he does want to help Ukraine with its air defense. Do you think that that includes these Patriot air defense systems that apparently the Pentagon actually said they weren't going to be giving to Ukraine?
I think the policy on the transfer of weapons to Ukraine is now up in the air. We had a phone call between Trump and Putin yesterday that didn't go so well. Trump said no progress on getting a peace deal. The call today with Zelensky seems to have been positive. And it is the case that soon after Trump hung up the phone with Putin yesterday, you had some 550 missiles and drones attack Ukraine. And almost looks like Putin is putting his thumb in the eye of Donald Trump. He doesn't like to be toyed with, and that may in some ways have made him tilt more toward Zelensky. Is he going to make a decision to restart the transfer of Patriots to Ukraine? Is he going to tell the Pentagon not to suspend the aid that it suspended this week? We don't know. And I think in some ways the $6 million question, which we don't have an answer to yet, is when the $61 billion that Biden got out of Congress, which is what Trump is still using to fund weapons to Ukraine, when that runs out this summer, is Trump going to ask Congress for more money? Let's wait and see.
What about the role of Ukraine's allies, European nations? Let's say, there is no more funding coming from the Trump administration. Can those other countries fill in the gaps? Are they able to provide enough defense at the very least so that Ukraine can continue to defend itself against these sorts of attacks by Russia?
You know, can Ukraine hold on if the United States turns off the spigot? I think the answer to that is probably yes, because the EU, the UK, they stand firmly by Ukraine. They continue to send arms. They continue to send economic support. But there are some things that Ukraine needs from the United States that Europeans don't have, like Patriot interceptors, like ATACMS, which are long-range attack weapons, like other kinds of precision-guided munitions that only the United States has. Yes, maybe the Europeans could buy some of those weapons from the United States, but if Trump really does decide that when that $61 billion runs out, we're done, I think Ukraine, both from a morale perspective, but also from a hardware perspective, will not be in good shape.
It's interesting that you mentioned that word morale, because we saw what was the largest attack so far on Ukraine by Russia, more than 500 drones, 11 missiles targeting Kyiv. Do you think morale plays into some of the strategy by Russia with those sorts of attacks? Is it also attacking the morale of Ukrainians?
Well, clearly, I think Putin is playing a long game here, where he thinks he can break the will of the Ukrainians over time, and he can outlast the West politically. You already have here in the United States a government that is unsure that it wants to keep supporting Ukraine. You have in some EU countries, such as Hungary and also Slovakia, governments that are also wavering on this issue. You have, even in France and Germany, far-right movements, the National Rally in France, the AfD in Germany, that are taking a more pro-Russian and anti-aid to Ukraine position. So I think what Putin is doing here is saying, hey, I'm just going to stay in the game. I'm going to keep hitting the Ukrainians. Time is on my side. And it really requires Trump to say to Putin, no, I'm ready to help you negotiate a peace deal. But if you don't negotiate that peace deal, I'm going to give Ukraine the money and the arms it needs to stop you cold.
Professor, about 30 seconds left, but there is a sanctions bill sitting there in the Senate. It has bipartisan support. What's the likelihood, do you think, that if the White House doesn't want to turn the spigot back on in terms of money, it could push for that bill to be passed?
I think some incremental tightening of the sanctions, yes. That bill envisages far-reaching measures, including very high levels of tariffs of anybody who buys Russian fossil fuel, including India and China. That's really a non-starter. So bottom line here is, yes, tightening the sanctions can help put pressure on Russia. But in the end of the day, Trump's key decision is, are you going to keep giving Ukraine the arms it needs to defend itself?
Charles Kupchan with the Council on Foreign Relations. Always great to get your perspective on the BBC. Thank you.
Good to be with you.
Police say at least 13 people have died after heavy rains triggered flash flooding in south central Texas. About 20 children who are staying at a children's summer camp there are unaccounted for. That's according to the state's lieutenant governor. Hundreds of people joined search and rescue teams after floodwaters swept through Texas's hill country on Friday. Months of rain fell in the space of just a few hours, swelling the level of the Guadalupe River some 26 feet. The deluge is the latest in a string of dangerous flooding events across the state of Texas this year. Well, the lieutenant governor spoke a little bit earlier.
We always say in these situations, thoughts and prayers. I'm asking the people of Texas, do some serious praying this afternoon, on your knees kind of praying, that we find these young girls and that they're only unaccounted for because they're somewhere that we don't know yet, but that they're alive and safe, and we will find them. If they're alive and safe, we will find them and bring them home to you.
Jason Allen is a correspondent with our U.S. partner CBS News. He sent us this update from Kerrville, Texas. A striking scene there behind you. Just tell us what you're seeing there on the ground and what's the latest that you know.
And to give you some context, Carl, where we are standing right now, and you can see the river back here behind me, but where we are standing, this was all underwater earlier this morning. And in fact, the water got a lot further than where we are. In fact, reaching up to the top of the decks of this restaurant that is back here behind me. This rose in just a few hours, and in fact, it made that last burst. Somebody who works here and owns this property told me it made that last burst in about 45 minutes. I've covered a lot of disasters, hurricanes and floods and tornadoes, some of those here in Texas. And usually when you arrive on a scene, you can kind of tell what was damaged, what was destroyed. Were there homes, were there businesses, people picking up debris? In this case, there's really no context for what this was because the floodwater, the Guadalupe River, washed it all away. I had to ask the owner of the property what it was. This was an RV park, one of a few that are located here along the river. And this was a holiday weekend, the 4th of July, very big here in this picturesque part of the state. And there were dozens and dozens of recreational vehicles that were parked here along the river. And there were also dozens and dozens of small cabins that people were staying in for the holiday. And as you can see back here behind me, all of those structures, all of those RVs are now gone, and they are somewhere, as you look down there through the debris, somewhere down the river. Those scar marks, by the way, that you can see on the trees, that is where, somebody told us, is where they saw the houses and the RVs scraping and bouncing off the trees as the flood carried them down the river. Carl?
Just unbelievable scenes there, Jason. And I guess, you know, given what you said there, the number of people there, obviously, for the holiday weekend, those RVs, was there any kind of warning given? Do we know how the authorities responded to this incident?
State officials a couple of days ago did start activating some more resources, looking at the forecast, knowing there was potential for heavy rain and possibly flooding. So they got some of those resources, boats, helicopters in place just in case anything happened. But we talked to people who were here last night, and they said there was no sense of anything this incredible, really. In fact, they welcomed the rain. It's been extremely dry here in this part of the state. They welcomed the rain. They needed it. The plants, the trees, the animals, they were grateful for it. It wasn't really until about 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning when it started raining extremely hard that they started to get concerned. Even then, no warnings were going out from law enforcement. They do not have sirens here, which are common in tornado-prone areas of Texas. So there was no public warning system available. They said it wasn't until 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning that people realized the water was coming up fast. At that point, first responders came and started knocking on doors, trying to get people out. Many of them, at least here, did get away, but we have talked to people who said they know that some people were washed down the river.
Jason, before I let you go, we have to ask you about Camp Mystic. I believe that's where some 20 kids are still unaccounted for. What more do we know there?
There are a number of camps that are located up the river. That camp is in that direction. That's where it is. There were more than 700 girls that were there, still more than 20 who are unaccounted for. I will tell you, though, and I'm surprised we haven't seen one in the last few minutes, there are still helicopters flying up and down the river. I'm not sure I've ever seen this before. Helicopters are flying, and they are pausing right now at the treetops, and they are taking a very close look in the branches just to see if anybody might be up there waiting to be found. So this is still an active rescue mission. They're still hoping that they may find survivors along the riverbanks.
Now, for Britpop fans, it's finally here, the comeback tour of Oasis. The band kicked off their hugely anticipated reunion with a gig in Wales tonight. The last time the Gallagher brothers were on stage together was back in 2009. Their appearance at the Principality Stadium in Cardiff was the first of 41 concerts around the world, which have sold out fast. Mark Savage reports.
After a 16-year wait, Oasis are back. 70,000 fans, 16 years of pent-up demand. The first night of the Oasis reunion tour is finally here. More than 10 million people from 158 countries applied for tickets, and the lucky ones are all in Cardiff today.
Today is what every superfan or any fan is waiting for. This is the pinnacle. This is the holy grail of Oasis. So very, very excited. This is massive.
They'll be the biggest band then, and I think they'll be the biggest band again now.
You know, our expectations are very, very high because we miss them a lot.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of emotion in that stadium, isn't there?
Yeah. I get emotional just thinking about it, mate.
For fans like these, Oasis were the soundtrack to the 1990s.
This is a band that's kind of woven into how we think about music in this country. You know, the songs that they play are like, they're sung on terraces, they're sung at weddings, they're sung in pubs. They're kind of part of who it is to be British.
They sold tens of millions of records, but backstage tension between brothers Liam and Noel Gallagher led to a split in 2009.
He doesn't like me, you know, but he doesn't like me in a violent way. I don't get on with him.
Ever since, they've been asked about a reunion.
I mean, obviously I miss being in a band and being with my brother and all that, because I think we're good and I think we were good and I think there's been nothing like us since.
He's going to have to call me. He's going to have to get somebody to call me.
Now, the wait is over.
Well, before we go, a reminder of our top story, that developing situation there in Texas. Some 20 children still unaccounted for. Search and rescue teams are still looking for any potential people who survived, who are missing. And of course, we know several people dead in that event there as well. I'm Carl Nassman in Washington. We'll stay on top of that story for you and all the day's top headlines right here on BBC News.